The crystal hall of the Valar Dominion glittered as though it had been carved from starlight itself. Rows of alien nobles, dressed in shimmering silks and armor polished to blinding sheen, filled the banquet chamber. At the far end, elevated above all others, sat Empress Lunara. Her skin was the color of twilight, a soft violet glow that seemed alive under the chandelier's firelight, and her long white hair fell over her shoulders like liquid silver. As always, the seats beside her remained empty. No one dared approach, let alone sit. To sit at her side was to invite judgment sharper than blades, a gesture equal to claiming kinship or challenging power. For decades, those chairs had stayed untouched, polished but unused, serving as reminders that the Empress of the Valar ate alone. That silence shattered the moment Kale walked in. He wasn't dressed in jeweled robes. No sigils, no crest. Just a worn jacket smeared with grease and dust, a satchel slung over his shoulder, blueprints and tools peeking from its folds. His hair was dark and messy, his boots scuffed from weeks of work in the Dominion's workshops. To him, this place was a labyrinth of faulty wires and broken relays, not a throne of gods. He looked tired, distracted, as though sleep had become optional. Without scanning the room, without acknowledging the frozen eyes of 100 nobles, Kale strolled straight down the gleaming carpet and dropped himself into the nearest seat, at Lunara's side. The room exhaled in one collective gasp. Goblets froze halfway to lips. Hands tightened on the hilts of ornamental blades. Courtiers exchanged looks that bordered on panic, as if this lone human had spat on sacred ground. Guards shifted, ready to strike, but held back only because they were waiting for a command. Lunara tilted her head, pale strands of hair brushing her cheek. Her golden eyes, sharp and unyielding, locked on the man scribbling across his notes with a stub of graphite. She had seen lords bend until their foreheads bled on the marble. She had seen rivals tremble when they dared meet her gaze. And yet this human, Kale, barely looked up. He tore off a piece of bread from a silver platter, chewed absently, then muttered while sketching lines over wiring diagrams. "What? You saving this seat for someone else?" The nobles nearly fainted. The sound of suppressed horror rippled through the hall like thunder. But Lunara did not rise. She did not strike. Instead, her lips curved into the faintest smile, the kind her court had not seen in years. Her voice, velvet soft yet carrying like song, reached only him. "Do you know where you sit, human?" Kale's eyes stayed on his parchment. He swallowed another mouthful of bread, pencil scratching as though her words were background noise. "Seat's a seat. Long walk in here, wasn't about to stand." One guard bristled, hand tightening on his weapon. A flicker of Lunara's fingers stilled him instantly. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath, but the Empress only leaned back slightly, golden eyes narrowing with amusement. "Then it seems," she murmured, "the seat has found its occupant." Kale hummed distractedly, still scribbling lines. "Guess so." The nobles glanced at each other in disbelief, their plates untouched, their jewels clinking with nervous tremors. Yet Lunara ignored them all. Her attention lingered only on the grease-stained man at her side. He paused long enough to glance at her untouched feast, roasted meats, jeweled fruits, dishes brought from across star systems. "You going to eat that?" he asked casually, nodding toward her plate. The silence that followed felt like a blade against the throat. But then, Lunara laughed. Not the cold, clipped laugh she used to cut through council debates, but something warmer, brighter, startling even to her guards. She slid the nearest platter toward him with a graceful motion. "Help yourself, human." Kale blinked, as though he hadn't expected her to say yes. Then he shrugged, spearing a slice of roast with his knife. "Don't mind if I do." He piled vegetables beside it, chewing noisily as crumbs tumbled onto his diagrams. And Lunara watched. Watched as though no one else in the room existed. He spoke between bites, blunt and unbothered. "So, what's your name?" Every noble stiffened. They had spent lifetimes calling her Majesty, flame of Valor, keeper of the crown. But this man, this ordinary worker, simply asked. Her lips curved. Lunara. Kale nodded, chewing. Ha. Sounds familiar. I'm Kale. He offered no bow, no flourish. Just the name. The sound of it hung in the vaulted chamber like a forbidden spell. The Empress of an empire, addressed as though she were a stranger at a roadside inn. The guards twitched again, but her lifted hand stilled them. Kale leaned back, pencil tapping against the paper. He squinted at the ceiling, then pointed with his eraser. Wiring's a mess in here. Circuits cross like a drunk laid them. Fire hazard waiting to happen. A noble fainted outright. Another choked on his wine. Lunara's golden eyes sharpened. For a moment, the court thought she would kill him for the insult. But instead, she leaned forward, studying his sketches. You believe my hull is dangerous? Dangerous? Kale laughed through a mouthful of roast. Nah. Just waiting to explode. Sparks don't care about crowns. A ripple of outrage swept the chamber, whispers rising like a storm. Yet Lunara laughed again, her shoulders shaking with genuine mirth. And for the first time in decades, the throne room did not echo with fear. It echoed with her laughter, laughter shared with a human who dared sit beside her, utterly unaware of the weight of her crown. Kale stabbed at his parchment again, muttering about conduits. Lunara's gaze softened, and she tilted her chin in her palm, smiling faintly as she studied him. A man so ordinary, so irreverent, yet already rewriting the silence of her hull. The next evening, the crystal chandeliers above the banquet hall burned brighter, as though the servants had polished every jewel in fear of what might unfold. The nobles whispered behind their goblets, retelling the scandal of the night before with nervous delight. An outsider, a human, had sat at the Empress's side. And worse, she had laughed. When Kale entered again, grease still smudged across his sleeves and satchel clinking with tools, the hall froze. Whispers turned sharp, like blades on whetstone. Surely he would be executed this time, they thought. Surely the Empress had simply been playing with her prey. But Kale strolled straight down the carpet and took the same seat beside Lunara, dropping a coil of wire onto the table as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The noble's outrage was nearly audible. One lord clutched his chest, another muttered a prayer under his breath. Yet Lunara only raised her hand, silencing them all with a flick of her fingers. Her lips curved faintly, the pale shimmer of her white hair brushing against violet shoulders. You return, she said softly, her golden eyes locking on him. Kale smirked, pulling a scrap of parchment free. Still some wiring to fix. And your bread's better than mine. A ripple of gasps. Bread, as though the Empress's feast were no more than a worker's meal. But Lunara laughed again, warm and unguarded, and the nobles' protests died in their throats. Kale leaned over his blueprint, pencil scratching in quick strokes. Look, he said, pointing at a crude sketch of the ceiling. These chandeliers. Pulling way too much power for decoration. Whoever designed them cared more about sparkle than safety. It's an overload waiting to fry half the hull. A cluster of nobles turned pale. They were, after all, the very ones who had overseen the palace's construction. Lunara followed his lines with her gaze, the corners of her lips tugging upward. And what would you do differently, Kale? He jabbed his pencil at the parchment. Separate circuits. Isolate the breakers so one spark doesn't take out the whole wing. And maybe don't hide power relays behind ornamental plating. Pretty doesn't stop fire. One noble actually hissed in outrage, but Lunara ignored him, laughter spilling from her like sunlight through clouds. It startled even her guards, who shifted uneasily at the sound. Kale shoveled another bite of roast into his mouth, oblivious. Guess that's why you dragged me in. Somebody's gotta stop this place from turning into a fireworks show. Lunara tilted her head, golden eyes glittering. And do you always speak so boldly of your employer's palace? Employer? Kale wiped his mouth on his sleeve. If the wiring's bad, it's bad. Doesn't matter whose name is on the door. Sparks don't bow to titles. The silence that followed was so heavy it nearly cracked the air. Nobles clenched their fists, guards stiffened, every gaze drilling into him with horror. But Lunara leaned closer, chin resting in her palm, her smile soft and amused. Perhaps the Dominion should be run by men who speak like you. For the first time, Kale looked up at her fully. His eyes were tired, skeptical, but bright. Sounds like more work than I want. But yeah, things would get done faster. The nobles nearly dropped their goblets as Lunara laughed again, her voice ringing across the vaulted ceiling. A rare, unrestrained sound, too warm, too human for the figure who ruled them. And what would you demand for such service, she teased, her smile curving sly. Kale leaned back in his chair, balancing it precariously on two legs. Double pay, at least. All this for stale bread? He waved the hunk of crust he'd grabbed. Lunara's laughter spilled brighter, richer than the jeweled wines before her. For a heartbeat, the chamber was filled not with fear, but with her joy. And every noble knew, with sinking certainty, that something had shifted in their Empress. Still chewing, Kale finally frowned at her, suspicion dawning too late. Wait. You said, we would triple your pay. We? For the first time, he really looked at her. The violet glow of her skin. The flowing silver crown. The sigils etched across her armor. The way the entire room bowed to her breath. His hand froze around a goblet of wine he'd stolen from her spread. His throat worked as he swallowed hard. His voice cracked. You're the Empress. Lunara's smile deepened, golden eyes glittering. Of course. It is my duty to oversee the Dominion's funds. The word landed like a hammer. Kale spat wine into his goblet, coughing into his sleeve. Oh hell, he muttered under his breath, shoving his blueprints aside. Oh hell. I did say the hull's beautiful, didn't I? Majestic. Best I've ever seen. Except, well, he winced. Except the wiring. The nobles gasped, awaiting his execution. But Lunara only laughed again, softer this time, velvet and warm. I am not offended. In truth, I value such bluntness. My nobles nod their heads until their necks ache. Not one dares tell me where my empire might burn to ash. Kale rubbed the back of his neck, flustered. Guess I'm not much of a people person. Should have noticed the crown. Perhaps, she whispered, leaning slightly closer, her voice only for him, that is why I enjoy your company. And the hall, stunned into silence, watched their Empress smile, not at lords, not at generals, but at a grease-stained human who had treated her like anyone else. The days that followed felt like living in someone else's dream. One evening Kale had been nothing more than a tired engineer muttering about faulty relays, and the next he found himself walking the gilded corridors of the Dominion's heart, flanked by armored guards who bowed their heads as though he belonged. He didn't. Not really. He still smelled of solder and smoke, still had grease smudged across his knuckles. His satchel was heavier with tools than food. Yet somehow, he now carried a platinum clearance emblem that opened doors nobles spent lifetimes trying to approach. And all because the Empress herself had said, in front of everyone, that he would stay. The nobles despised him for it. Kale could feel their glares follow him like knives each time he entered the great hall, blueprints tucked under one arm. They whispered that he had bewitched her, or worse, that Lunara had gone mad. But none dared speak aloud. Not after she had laughed openly in his presence, not after she had ordered his pay tripled, not after her golden gaze had lingered on him with such dangerous warmth. Kale didn't care. He had work to do. Within a week, scaffolds rose like skeleton ribs along the throne hall's inner walls. Ornamental panels were pried away, revealing tangled guts of conduit behind the gold-plated facades. Kale spent hours perched on ladders, muttering curses under his breath while sparks jumped from his soldering iron. Guards flinched at every crackle, though he seemed unbothered. "You people ever heard of proper insulation?" he barked one afternoon, yanking out a charred coil. "No wonder this place nearly cooks itself." The guards exchanged nervous glances. Yet when Lenara herself appeared, crimson robes flowing behind her, she only smiled faintly. "You sound more like a ruler every day," she teased. Kale smirked, smearing soot across his sleeve. "Nah. Rulers point at problems. I actually fix them." Her laughter rang bright through the chamber, echoing across marble arches, startling the workers who had never heard such a sound. Kale only grinned wider, oblivious to the way the nobles stiffened at every echo. Evenings became something different. He no longer approached the banquet table as an intruder. Now, servants guided him to the seat at Lenara's side as though it had always been his. The first time it happened, he had chuckled nervously, but by the third, he sat with ease, blueprints shoved aside to make space for steaming plates. Their meals stretched long after the food was gone. Lenara would lean her chin against her hand, golden eyes sharp and curious, asking him questions no one else would dare. "What do humans eat when not at a feast? How do your people court? Without thrones and crowns, what makes one special? Why do you never bow?" Kale, chewing on roast, would shrug. "Bowing doesn't fix wiring. And honestly, I'm too stiff in the knees for that nonsense." Her laughter spilled out until her eyes shimmered with tears, leaving nobles to wonder whether the empire itself had shifted. One night, after dismissing the lords early, Lenara remained with only Kale in the vast crystal hall. The chandeliers glowed above, their circuits newly rewired by his hand. The scent of roast and wine lingered, though most of the platters lay empty. "Do you ever tire of speaking so plainly to me?" she asked, her voice low in the emptiness. Kale swallowed, chasing it with a gulp of wine. He tilted his head, smirking. "Why? You getting bored of it?" Her lips curved slowly. "Quite the opposite." The words caught him off guard. He'd meant it as a joke, but the look in her eyes was unguarded, warmer than he'd ever seen. For the first time in weeks, Kale had no quick retort. He busied himself with scraping crumbs off a plate, pretending not to notice the weight of her gaze. She slid one of her untouched platters toward him. "Take more," she said softly. Kale chuckled, shaking his head as he filled his plate again. "You're never letting me live down that stale bread comment, are you?" "Never," she answered, amusement curling her tone. The grandeur of the hall seemed smaller then, gentler. They sat in quiet companionship, and Kale found himself glancing at her longer than he should have. The way her silver crown glowed against her white hair. The way her laugh carried warmer than any fire. He looked away quickly, shoving another bite into his mouth. But the smile lingered on his lips long after. Nights blurred into routine. Kale would arrive still dusted with ash, blueprints sticking out of his satchel, and Lenara would wave away nobles, attendants, even guards, until only the two of them remained. Sometimes they argued about wiring, sometimes about food, sometimes about absurdities like why her throne was so uncomfortable. Other times she spoke of childhood tutors too afraid to correct her, or the loneliness of a crown that silenced every laugh. Kale listened. He never pretended to understand what it meant to rule an empire, but when she finished, he leaned back in his chair, stretched, and said something so ordinary, so unvarnished, that it made her laugh again. "You know," he told her one evening, smirking as he tossed a bread crust into his mouth, "I've probably fixed half your palace by now. If it doesn't stop catching fire, I'm charging overtime." Her laughter burst out so suddenly that she covered her mouth with both hands, violet shoulders shaking. "You are the only man in Valor who dares threaten me with an invoice." Kale grinned. "Not a threat. Guarantee." The chamber fell into a different kind of silence. Not cold, not stifling, but heavy with something unspoken. Lunara studied him for a long moment, her chin resting lightly in her palm. At last, her voice softened. Do you know why I keep asking you back here? Kale raised a brow, half a smirk tugging at his lips. Because I tell you when your wiring's terrible. Her smile softened. Because you remind me that I am not only an empress. The words silenced him. For once, Kale had no quip. No joke. He only leaned forward, his hand brushing hers on the tabletop, hesitant, almost accidental. She didn't pull away. For a moment, neither spoke. The weight of the hull melted, and Lunara's violet skin flushed faintly, her golden gaze lingering on his. Stay, she whispered. Kale's grin returned, softer this time. Wasn't planning on leaving. And for the first time in years, Lunara no longer looked like a woman bound to a lonely throne. She looked simply like Lunara, violet and radiant, smiling at the human who had dared sit at her side. The grand hall faded into memory the night Lunara finally led Kale beyond its towering doors. The corridors of her palace stretched wide and endless, every wall carved with constellations and edged in glowing crystal. Servants scattered from her path, bowing until their foreheads brushed marble. Guards saluted in silence. But Lunara didn't pause. She walked with purpose, her white hair trailing like comet light, until she stopped before a pair of onyx doors marked with the sigil of her line. Her private chambers. Kale hesitated only a heartbeat before following her inside. The room glowed with warm violet light, silken banners draped across high walls. Relics from a dozen conquered worlds lined the shelves, crystalline globes, blades humming with dormant power, scrolls bound in alien script. At the center stood a low table set with 2 delicate glasses and a decanter filled with shimmering blue liquid. Kale gave a low whistle, half grinning. Nice place. Don't suppose you need me to rewire it, too? Lunara actually giggled, a sound she would never allow within the throne hall. At this rate, perhaps I do. She poured the liquid with steady hands, its glow catching the sharp gold in her eyes. When she offered one glass to him, her voice softened. Tonight, Kale, I do not want to speak of wires or palaces. Tonight, I only wish for your company. He took the glass with a crooked smile, sniffed at the shimmering drink, and raised a brow. Looks like it could melt steel. If I wake up tomorrow fixing chandeliers, I'm billing you triple. Her laugh was light and unguarded, almost girlish. Then perhaps it would be worth the cost. The glasses clinked, and the liquid burned fire down his throat before settling into a warm hum that loosened every knot in his chest. What is this stuff? He asked, blinking. Moon wine, she answered, swirling her own glass. Fermented beneath the twin moons of my world. Rare. Precious. I do not share it often. Kale tilted his glass toward her. Guess that makes me special. Her violet cheeks flushed faintly, and she looked down at the swirling glow. You are, she said simply. The night stretched smaller as they talked. He told stories of botched apprenticeships and once wiring a kettle into a security system, an accident that triggered alarms whenever someone brewed coffee. Lunara laughed so hard she nearly spilled her wine, her shoulders shaking as white strands slipped loose from her crown. In turn, she confessed small secrets, how as a child she'd longed to run through the corridors barefoot, how tutors never dared correct her handwriting, how the weight of her title sometimes pressed heavier than armor. The artifacts, the banners, the gilded edges of her world seemed to fade until there was only her laughter, his grin, and the brush of their hands as they refilled each other's glasses. When silence finally came, it wasn't cold. It was close, intimate. Lunara set her glass down, her fingers lingering on the rim. She drew in a breath, steadying herself, but her voice still trembled when she spoke. Do you know how long I have sat in that hall, surrounded by hundreds, yet feeling utterly alone? Kale's grin faded. He studied her, not as an empress, not as the violet-skinned ruler draped in power, but as a woman with loneliness etched deep in her words. He leaned forward, his voice softer than he'd meant. Can't say I know what it's like to be Empress. But I know what it's like to eat alone. Her golden eyes lifted, catching his, unguarded. He reached across the table, brushed his hand against hers. Warm skin against warm skin. She didn't pull away. I'm not going anywhere, he murmured. Not unless you tell me to. Her breath caught. For the first time in years, she let her crown slip from her thoughts. Instead of answering, she leaned closer, golden gaze flicking to his mouth before returning to his eyes. Kale chuckled softly, nervous but certain. Guess the wine's doing its job, he whispered. Perhaps, she breathed back. And then her lips touched his. Tentative at first, as though testing a boundary no one had dared before. Kale froze only a moment before leaning into it, his hand rising to rest gently against her cheek. She tasted of moon wine and something richer, something impossible to name. When they parted, she lingered close, her forehead resting against his. Her violet skin glowed faintly warmer, a blush she could not hide. Stay, she whispered again. Kale smiled, his thumb brushing her cheek. Told you I wasn't planning on leaving. For the first time, Lenara believed it. The morning after came too quickly. Sunlight spilled across tall arched windows, scattering across Kale's guest chamber. He groaned, rubbing at his temples. His lips still tingled. His mind replayed it again and again, her laugh, her hand on his, her eyes soft as she kissed him. I kissed the Empress, he muttered, collapsing back against the sheets. Oh hell. I kissed the Empress. And worse, he wanted to do it again. A knock at the door startled him. When he opened it, a palace attendant stood with a tray of food, steaming bread, glazed meats, jeweled fruit. Compliments of Her Majesty, the servant said, bowing low. Kale blinked, then grinned. Stale bread, huh? She's never letting me live that down. He set the tray on the bed, laughing quietly to himself as he tore into it. Whatever came next, he didn't know. But he knew this, he had sat beside the Empress when no one dared, and somehow, impossibly, she had kissed him back. And so the story of the empty seat became legend in the Crystal Hall of Valor. For years, nobles whispered that no one dared sit at the Empress's side. Until one human did. A man who ignored crowns, who cared more about circuits than titles, who laughed over bread and sketched wiring diagrams while dining with royalty. Kale never meant to change anything. He had only wanted to fix the palace's failing systems. But his irreverence, his honesty, and his refusal to treat Lenara as anything but human broke through the silence that had walled her in. Night after night, their conversations softened the hall's cold grandeur, turning it into something warmer. And when he stayed, when he kissed her, it became more than scandal. It became a promise. Not of thrones or empires, not of crowns or power. But of companionship. Of laughter unafraid. Of a woman who had long dined alone, finally smiling beside someone who saw her not as Empress, but simply as Lenara. And that, perhaps, was more powerful than any title. If you enjoyed this tale of forbidden seats, unlikely bonds, and laughter strong enough to topple silence, then don't forget to subscribe for more. Hit that like button if you want to hear more stories of humans and aliens breaking the rules of their worlds. And share this story with someone who could use a reminder that even the most untouchable throne can be warmed by the right company. Until next time, traveler, keep your tools handy, keep your humor sharp, and maybe, just maybe, dare to take the seat no one else will.